Hello, everyone. Um, Thanks very much for joining us today for this first panel of what we call the Truth Series. It's going to deal about words, it's going to deal with words. The Truth is a series of webinars that the Transformers Foundation is setting up to discuss confusing or misleading concepts or terms or words in our industry. We will invite experts from different segments to tell us about, what's right and what's wrong on different topics. The one today is about words, terms that are used like, joker words in, all kind of messages around us for different purposes, mostly marketing. The second of this, the Truth Series, will deal with greenwashing and will take place on the 9th of December at 5 p.m. Central European Time. So we're happy to have a group of experts and, with extremely long experience and knowledge on the topics we're going to discuss today. And I would like to introduce first to Adriana Galijasevic. Adriana is a designer and an action researcher, is an innovator and an educator, and is an advocate for circular economy in fashion industry based on cradle-to-cradle design principles. And I know Adriana since quite a long time. Hello, Adriana.
Hello, thank you for having me. Great to see you all.
Pleasure. Thank you, Adriana. Then we have Ignacy Cubilla. He's based in Spain. Ignacy is a biologist, and he has been dedicated to implement and innovate in the circular economy based on cradle-to-cradle principles. Cradle-to-cradle is a cradle-to-cradle certified assessor since 2013 and participates in projects and conferences around the world, like Waste Build, Amsterdam, Kingpins, Amsterdam, etc. And collaborates in several university programs like UAAN, Colombia, IIT, Barcelona, IQS, amongst others. Hi, Ignacy. Good to have you on board. Thank you.
Hi, Miguel. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Then it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Pamela Ravasio. She is specialized in corporate governance and responsibility with a strong link to innovation processes and digitalization. She has worked as a consultant with very small and very, very big companies, and also has been in corporate roles such as global stakeholder manager, as well as head of CSR and sustainability. Good afternoon, Dr. Ravasio. Good afternoon, Pamela.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. And then it's Scott that is based in Portland, so it's fairly early for him, but he seems to be very well awake. Thank you. Thank you, Scott, for being with us. Scott is the Senior Director of ZDHC Roadmap to Zero program. He has a bachelor and a master degree in chemistry and textile chemistry, and over 30 years of experience that has ranged from environmental chemistry to textile and footwear product chemistry. Previously, he was part of the Nike Material Science. This is where I met you, Scott, when you were with Nike.
Right.
And he was the environmental manager for CNA Europe. He's based, as I said, in Portland, Oregon. So we will be discussing a series of words. And the first one that we are going to deal with, and there will be a video to introduce you for the call, is going to be sustainability. So on with the video.
So what does hope for a better future look like? What responsibility do we have to change the world around us? Can we be the catalyst of cultural movements towards a powerful social good? Do you believe that you can make a difference in a time such as this? Versatile yet powerful, life changer and activist, rooted sustainability, different and accepted. The year of purpose, the year value is added to life, the year the fashion industry changes. Poverty and pollution are the reality behind our clothes. We are new, we are fair, we are safe for everyone. Created for positive change, designed with nature in mind. Still trying to get over the fact that someone in the 21st century is telling me that fast fashion is leading to global exploitation, contributing to the 36 million people living in modern slavery. Systematic exploitation remains rife. Basic health and safety measures do not exist. Millions of workers live in poverty with excessive hours, unpaid overtime, poor health, exhaustion, sexual harassment and slavery. Practices need to change. Do we need to go on? Not to mention the environment. 2 million tons of clothing are thrown away each year in the UK. This leads to the clothing industry being the second largest polluter in the world. But clothing is our identity, an expression. It tells our story, our character, who we are. Is there an alternative?
Yeah, that's sustainability. The video was chosen because they speak about sustainability from different angles. One is about the environment, and the other one is about the social responsibility. So the question for the panel is, what do you think about the word sustainability? Is there any specific description? Is it used properly? Does it have to be withdrawn from marketing? What do you think? Please, anyone.
I think the important thing is to define what it is what is the sustainability aspect you're looking at. I think it's got so many aspects that it's left undefined, and a lot of people commit to more sustainable, but they don't really talk about what it is they're doing or what they're changing.
And you, Adriana, for example, you've been involved in promotion and things using the word sustainability. What do you think about this word?
I mean,
nowadays?
It's I always go back to the definition, that was in our common future or the Brundtle's report. Like sustainability is ability to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. So I think this video kind of shows, all this pollution and things that are going on, how they are preventing us from moving forward. I mean, sustainability is actually just a survival strategy. I mean, if we want to assure that we want to be there tomorrow, that means that we have to have respect for the resources that are around us. I mean, the essence of sustainability you can find also in the history, from the 1600s. Webster Lake in Massachusetts, for example, was given by the indigenous American community name, which I cannot pronounce, but it roughly translates into, we fish on our side, you fish on your side, and nobody fishes in the middle. So this, I think, nicely depicts the essence of sustainability in terms of respect for the resources, and which are vital to our survival, and not only of as humans, but also other ecosystems. So that's how I see sustainability.
And Pamela, I mean, is there any overuse of the word sustainability these days? I mean, it's so much used that people are, kind of doesn't understanding or doesn't care about the word anymore. It's like rain, okay? It's there, but you don't pay attention.
I mean, there's a clear yes to that, not just in the context that we're speaking here, but I mean, if you think about, you use it also in terms of, is it economically sustainable? Meaning, can a company survive on the long run with whatever financial situation they have? So it is overused for just about anything that has the intent of or wanting to communicate something that is going to go on for longer. Can growth be sustained is another word in that context, and actually it's quite paradoxical to what we're talking right now. And I would still go with basically the definition like the donut economics use it, which is meaning the human rights of every person within the carrying capacity of our life-giving planet, and that over time for this generation and the generations to come.
Right. And Ignacio, just for you to end with your thoughts on sustainability and circularity and all these terms. Do they combine? Do they fit well with each other?
Well, as you know, Miguel, we don't really use the term sustainability in the cradle to cradle wall. So
exactly,
it's a little bit of a fundamental position for us.
That's why the question is.
Yeah. That's I mean, we've been always looking, and I think, by the way, that I think the definition is okay. I think how this definition is bringing to the ground level and to the different angles of our society is what has turned this into a buzzword, because I think the interpretation for most of the people is that, well, it's a way of maintenance. That's how we see it. I mean, even while speaking about even the environmental, the economical side of sustainability is typically a way of maintenance, whether I can sell these products at a certain margin, doing less bad and having some kind of a revenue. So this is not a long-term strategy. And I think that this is the main problem with sustainability. It's not a long-term strategy. It was framed as a long-term strategy, but it's not being applied as a long-term strategy. That's why we like a regenerative, we like more this idea of designing for abundance, rather than this, sustaining the wrong model. And by the way, this is what links to the circularity concept. I think that the sustaining a linear model is the wrong decision.
Right. We will speak about that a little bit later. Now we move on to Adriana to speak about something that is uses environmentally or eco-friendly. And Adriana, shouldn't be all of us be friendly with the environment?
I mean, yes, of course. We coexist. We are coexist.
Exactly. Yeah. So what do you think about this combination of terms that I use so
loosely?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, environmentally friendly or eco-friendly, like these are synonyms, of course, and they're normally allude to products or processes and services that have a minimal, reduced, or no harm to the environment. And environment in this setting means like the air, water, and land. So when we talk about impacts ranging from 0 to negligible to reduced, various scenarios could be implied here. So therefore, it's really important to clarify at least 3 things. And one is that, does this refer to entire product or only its parts? The second one is what kind of framework, guidelines, and or standards are referenced in this context? And the third one is how much of the reduced impact is there on water, chemistry, energy, and CO2 emissions? And what's the verification system used to provide such data? So I think by touching on these 3 areas, we have a clearer picture if we are talking about environmentally or eco-friendly term from a holistic or a fragmented perspective, which in the end helps us determine how environmentally friendly subject in the question really is.
Yeah, but Adriana, don't you think that the word friendly here is a little bit too much? I mean, it's too simple. It's too childish.
Yeah, it is. In the essence, it is. But considering that our processes of the past were not environmentally friendly and are just trying to pick up and sustain themselves, and that's why this, like it's this idea of doing less bad instead of being good. I mean, like especially Ignacy can expand in the circularity according to cradle principles. It's all about being good. It's like not even a question. I mean, sustainability is a condition for doing business. It's the basis. It's the RNA of the system, and then you have the DNA, which makes flourish the world and the people. So yeah, I think it's a bit absurd, but considering that we were not so environmentally friendly in the past, I get why it's used. But again, like if you are using it, like you have to really explain, like, are you referring to the entire product or only parts of it? What kind of frameworks, guidelines, or standards are you referencing in this context? And how much of the reduced impact is there? So right. I think then you can justify why you're calling it environmentally friendly, or, in the cradle world, you want to create environmentally positive.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably the right word, positive. I like the word positive. Yeah. Yes, I prefer positive rather than any other thing. We are moving now to some muddy waters with Scott. Initially, we wanted to put chemicals on the list of words misused, but we thought, listen, chemicals is everything. Water is a chemical, right? So we thought that better we mentioned hazardous. I have my shower in the morning with let's say, a product, a gel that doesn't contain any hazardous chemicals. So what is hazardous, Scott? Why so used to indicate, that something is terrible, worse than bad?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think you're right to leave off the word chemicals, because if we said chemicals, then everything applies to everything, including the chemicals that we're made up of. But I mean, I think intuitively people know that hazardous is something that's harmful or unsafe, but I think it's used kind of interchangeably with toxic, which isn't quite right. And to me, hazardous mean all, it's something obviously that can be harmful, cause harm, and chemicals in particular, they all have some sort of an inherent hazard. You could think of things like sugar, which in some situations you could say it's non-hazardous, but if you eat too much sugar, it's certainly hazardous to your health eventually. So, chemicals some of them have physical hazards, some of them have health hazards, some have environmental hazards. And I think it's important to kind of be clear about what we're talking about. And the other part of the confusion is there's the popular definition, and people generally know, okay, hazardous associated with a chemical in a product. But then there's also a legal definition, and there's even across that, there's not one single global standard yet. There is a global harmonized definition, but not everybody's adopted it. And so there's a lot of confusion. I think generally when people are talking about chemicals in the terms of sustainability and circular systems, we need to be specific. And for the instance in ZDHC, when we're looking at the MRSL, we're talking about things that are carcinogens, mutagens, teratogens, so things that cause embryonic damage, persistent things that stay in the environment like fluorochemicals, things that are possibly bioaccumulative that build up in the food chain, things that are just outright toxic that you could think of, things that might cause you to have eye damage or some sort of a toxic response, and then there's endocrine disruptors, so things that can not directly but indirectly maybe impact a system. And I think that it's important that we clarify what we're talking about when we mean hazardous, and recognize that there's a spectrum of hazardous responses from all chemicals, and that we have to work through that. We can't say we're never going to use a hazardous chemical, because that, taken to the extreme, basically says you're not going to use any chemicals.
Yes. There's a very short question additional to that, is that sometimes this type of terms, hazardous, is used for marketing. My product doesn't contain hazardous chemicals, meaning that the rest of the products contain hazardous chemicals. That's not fair, right?
Yeah, no, and I think I've seen marketing that says it's chemical free, which isn't fair either. I think that, I think that's where we're trying to work within, for instance, in ZDHC, to really put specific boundaries around it. So, at least what you're talking about in terms of what aspect you're addressing in terms of the hazard, and it allows you to make comparisons, because I think most people would say, oh, there's a lot of chemicals that you can think intuitively, okay, we don't want to use those. Those are so toxic, so hazardous. They have such a bad properties associated, and we don't want to use those. There's some that you could think of water, okay, well, water's pretty non-hazardous in most situations. And then in the middle, there's a lot of them that have, they're hazardous in one way you use it, but in another way you use it, it may not have the same hazard. And so a lot of times we're forced to choose in like a dye house. Do I use something that's a powder that might be a skin irritant, or do I choose one that's more of a vapor that might be an inhalation hazard? And that's where it becomes difficult, because a lot of times there's not a real clear choice, and you have to look at other aspects, and that gets into what Adriana was talking about, and looking at the bigger picture, looking at, well, how much, what's the water use associated with it. So you have to really look at it in the context.
Right. We're going to move now to another word that's called green. We will watch a video, and I will tell you some funny numbers I collected earlier today about this word. So let's move to a video, and let's discuss with Pamela afterwards. There's a lady looking at us. Yeah, hello.
Welcome back. So-called green fashion was once a small niche in the global marketplace, but now it's blossomed into a multi-billion-dollar industry. I took a look at how one designer is taking part in the trend. New York designer Tiziana Inglis is in the process of putting together her next collection. Isa Rodriguez, a color expert, goes through a selection of dyes Tiziana will use for her fabrics. All of the dyes are natural and have been extracted from plants.
We have logwood that is from the heartwood of a tree, the logwood tree.
Buy organic cottons from Japan, veg tanned leathers from France and Italy.
But all of her clothes are locally made in New York, and this has made her very popular among the socially conscious set.
Green fashion is an umbrella term that means many things. It can refer to garments that use sustainable fabrics. It can also refer to the manufacturing process, one that supports fair trade practices and a low carbon footprint. While the definitions vary, one thing is clear: green fashion is becoming increasingly popular.
Green apparel and accessories are a $5 billion annual business in the U.S. While that only accounts for roughly 2% of the overall U.S. fashion market, it is far larger than a decade ago, when sales of green fashion were less than $500 million. Fashion experts say events like the collapse of the Bangladeshi garment factory last April that killed more than 800 factory workers has made many U.S. consumers think more deeply about how and where their clothing is made. Brown says people are also more drawn to socially conscious clothing because they look better than in their early days when green clothing was synonymous with hemp and hippie culture.
Right, that's green. That's the question for Pamela is green fashion. Green fashion on the internet. If you Google green fashion, it has some 5.1 billion entries. I mean, come on. And people are talking like green fashion, like, it was everything. You heard on the video, people talking about natural dyes and organic cotton from Japan and things like that. So what's wrong? I mean, there's something wrong with that word, green. It looks nice, it's a nice color, but it's not the right word, right?
No, it is not. I mean, if you were to ask someone like me with an engineering background, originally I would say, well, green is between yellow and blue, and it's got a dominant wavelength of between 495 and 517 nanometers. That is green. Now, green obviously also has a history in how it's been used. It's been used for the mercantile class in the Middle Ages, as opposed to the nobles who were using red. It's used in the Gaelic culture. It's also used in the Islamic culture. So there's a whole cultural background to it, which leads us how it is used in this context, because surveys show that in America and Europe in particular, but not only, so I would say Western dominated culture, green is associated intuitively with nature, and in particular with pristine nature. And this is, I think, where the link is to what we just heard, because if you listen carefully, the term is associated with everything that has a root in what has that fuzzy feeling. This is natural, it's all original, how it used to be without human interference on the environmental side. Or on the social side, it has that, well, everything for the good, fuzzy, warm feeling of taking care of people just by claiming it. And I think this is the issue with the term. It's been literally used like you would use a paint on your wallpaper at home to overpaint all the rest of it, and you have to start dig quite deeply to understand what is really behind it. So green as such is just that, painted in another shade of green, good luck marketing.
Right. You mentioned green as a color for different things, but also when you see on the movies, when there is something toxic or bad, it used to have green color as well. So it's
jealousy. Jealousy, for instance, or sort of mold, something rotten, sometimes also painted in green. So yes, there's that other, but it's in terms of numbers, and if you go back in history, it's a much smaller, but probably more point and significance of the color.
Right. So, but you think that this is a totally empty thing? I mean, totally empty word without.
I think your numbers show that it is a very successful term for marketing departments to paint whatever they want to sell in a color that is associated with something better without having to prove it.
Right. Maybe blue will be a better color, right? But, okay, it's all right. But for me, combining colors and solid terms is a kind of, they don't fit well together, right? Like pink or red or black. Okay. Anyway, thank you. We're moving now to Ignacy, and we move to circularity. So, Ignacy, circularity is a very graphic term. I mean, it's you know, it ends and it starts and ends at the same point, right? Is it that simple?
Well, definitely I can tell you what circularity is not. It's not a linear economy in a circle. And it's not about colors.
Yes.
We have all the colors of the rainbow. So the starting point with circularity is that is a new socio-economical model, as opposed to the linear current prevailing model. So that's the main thing about circularity. That's why the definition of circularity, the very first definition of circularity is the one I like the most, you know, regenerative economy by design and intention. Because I think, by the way, that circular economy needs to be designed. So we are not inheriting a circular economy model, you know. The other thing is that we are not really mimicking nature. We're getting inspired by nature, you know. So we're not trying to replicate how does nature works, but rather what kind of lessons we can learn from nature. And I think the most important thing about circularity is that is a new relationship model, is a cultural change. I mean, the key aspect of circularity is not whether we have the right metrics or not. By the way, we don't have the right metrics yet. But I think the most important thing is this combination of having a positive impact and what kind of relationships you need to build up to have this positive impact within, I mean, humankind and between humans and nature. And that's why I think that circularity is perceived as a more practical agenda, you know, because it really touches some of the hotspots in our system, which is about relationships. We need a systemic change to get into a circular model, you know. And well, this is also one of the reasons why some people, well, they have some resistance about that, you know, because they don't really want to, I mean, to change their status quo.
Yeah, that's a big thing. But let's say it's circular, but don't you think that it will be better to define it like a spiral? Okay, so it's because you cannot end at the same point as where you started. Basically, you move on kind of circles, you know, to the future.
Well, a lot of people, they have this misinterpretation between circular and closed loop system. A closed loop system is thermodynamically impossible.
Yes,
we have an entropy problem, right? So entropy is there for something. So that's why we typically talk about open metabolism, interconnected open metabolisms, and endlessly, I mean, reutilization of nutrients, not just materials, but nutrients. So chemicals, by the way, building blocks. And I think this is a very important point. I remember when we started working with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we were all talking about material scarcity and how we can load materials and things like that. And we said, I mean, the material level is not the right level. We need to go down to the building blocks. And then they started talking about nutrients because on the other hand, I mean, nutrients is what, I mean, ecosystems are dealing with.
Yes.
Everything is a nutrient for another system or within the system.
Yes.
And yes, you're right. The spiral, I love it.
All right, just an idea. Just an idea. So thank you. We are going to move to another big word. It's called transparency. And there's a video for that. And then will be Adriana telling us about it. So video, please. Yeah, Adriana, transparency.
Yeah, it's a very
Tough topic, right?
tough topic, and also it's still very sad to see that we have factories like this. And that's where actually transparency comes in terms of, you know, it's an intel behind the sustainability and circularity in a way, because, you know, how can you hold somebody accountable if you don't know what's behind everything? Right. And not only that, like, how can you make any optimizations or improvements if you don't actually know what you're dealing with? So, I mean, it's really, you know, intel behind the sustainability and circularity in terms of, if we don't have the transparency, it's impossible to track, you know, the resource inputs, the levels of their purity, like what are the nutrients, and it's not possible to measure the impact. It's not possible to share the information. And it really makes it hard to provide any solution for the future. Yeah, it's really sad to see this video, but I hope we have moved a lot from, do you know when was this video made? It's probably a few years ago, no?
Well, they're quite recent. The only one that is a little bit old was the one I've been in fashion, that is from 2013, but this is still the topic. This video is actually from 1 year ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
why,
it just shows the absolute necessity for the transparency. And I mean, especially now with the, you know, the technology that's available, you know, blockchain technology, which serves as a great tool for establishing this like transparent supply chain, building trust, and actually also sharing directly with the customers or the citizens. It's a great tool, but however, before we can create this digital twin in the blockchain, it's imperative that the actual groundwork is done fairly.
Yes, exactly.
So it's really, yeah, without transparency, we are not moving anywhere.
Yeah, but do you think, Adriana, that is to have full transparency is almost impossible, because you need to say, check your suppliers, but at the same time, you have to check the suppliers of your suppliers. Yeah. And then the suppliers of the suppliers of the suppliers. It's kind of never ending.
But this is actually what's beautiful about cradle to cradle. When you look at the material health portion of the cradle to cradle, you go back through all your tiers, and like I never experienced in my entire career more transparency than working in the material health in terms of the cradle to cradle certifications, because you really, really go deeply into it, and that's why it's really important also to work with people that are open to it. I mean, there are certain regulations and rules and NDAs that you can follow, but still to provide the certain information in order to actually track. Because if we don't know what's in our things and how they are made, we cannot have the circularity or the, you know, infinite resources circling around. That's what the problem we have today. You know, a lot of stuff we are recycling, but in terms of transparency, we have no idea what it is. So then it's because it's never been designed to be recycled or put into another system. So, I mean, if we want to move forward, transparency it's intel of our work. So
that's right.
Yeah.
So now, well, this is something that we will discuss with Ignacy, because he's also, you know, on the Cradle to Cradle. We will be watching a video now about safe chemicals, and this is for preparing the discussion with Scott.
You go through a lot of trouble to avoid foods with chemicals or even tap water that could contain toxins. Are you really going far enough to keep from getting sick? Some doctors are now warning that what you wear could be dangerous to your health, especially for your children. In fact, while there are legal limitations for chemicals in children's toys, there are no regulations for children's clothing. Nikki Kimbleton takes a look at the dangerous chemicals in clothes and the so-called monsters that are in your closet.
Jessica Kay never expected to have a closet full of mostly cotton clothes. But a few years ago, she started reading about what's in and on a lot of clothing, and she got scared.
One of the big turning points was actually I found out about a chemical that causes sterility.
Now, her family wears clothes made mostly of organic materials.
And what I want to put on my body is not stuff with chemicals.
But when you're wearing everyday average clothing, that's exactly what Dr. Saman Soleimani says you're doing.
There is more than 8,000 chemicals in the textile industry that's used, which is pretty much insane. We're so concerned with all the chemicals that we ingest, but most people fail to realize that skin being the largest organ system absorbs everything it comes in contact with.
Dr. Soleimani points to a report released by Greenpeace, which detected a range of toxic chemicals in clothes. These include formaldehyde and phthalates, but you won't find these chemicals listed on tags. What you will find and what you want to avoid are items that say they contain polyester, spandex, and rayon. That means it could also contain chemicals, plus things that say they're wrinkle-free, iron-free, or even moisture-wicking. That could also be a red flag.
These kind of chemicals can cause anything from, rashes, asthma, fatigue, headaches, blurred vision, and the list goes on.
But avoiding clothes with chemicals is difficult. So how can you protect you and your family? The first step, try buying clothes that don't contain synthetics. But no matter what kind of clothes you get, you want to make sure that you wash them before wearing them. Greenpeace found when they retested clothes after they'd been washed, they contained only a fraction, even none, of the dangerous chemicals.
An organization called the Organic Clothing Alliance started in Jacksonville 2 years ago with the purpose of helping people find organic clothing for the entire family.
Well, I guess you're shocked, okay? Toxins in the tap water, don't wear synthetics. And chemicals can cause everything, okay? So there are no safe chemicals. This is the understanding.
Well, first of all, there was a lot of things that I would point out in there that are kind of misleading. And I would also like to say that as an NC State graduate, I'm sorry they use an NC State shirt as an example of their clothes. But so, I mean, the bottom line is, one is they talked about avoiding food and avoiding chemicals. Well, that's obviously not true. And they talk about natural, and natural isn't always this idea of safe, because there's a lot of things like toxic mushrooms, and there's a lot of examples of natural toxins. So that doesn't necessarily, again, we have to put it into context. And so I always avoid saying safe. It's like saying I'm a fast runner. Well, what does that mean? I mean, maybe I'm fast compared to the 2-year-old child down the street, but I may not be fast compared to somebody that's 30 years old and in reasonably good shape. So it's a context. You can't just say something is safe. That's an abstract point. It's always within comparison to something. And I think that's the key is, we're always striving to use safer chemicals, things that are inherently safer, things that can be handled in a safer manner. And it's always about the comparison. What am I comparing it to? If I'm removing a dye that we currently use, what is the hazard profile? What is the context that would say that the replacement is safer? Because we've seen in the past, people have just made a substitution, and they've substituted to the next, cousin of the chemical that was declared to be regulated or have a bad hazard profile. And then it turns out that, well, that chemical may have a similar or even worse hazard profile. There's examples in several years ago, probably 20, 25 years ago, they added additives to gasoline, and it turned out, to boost the octane, it was a chemical called MTBE. Well, it turns out that chemical is very mobile in water. And so you solved one problem by removing lead and things from gasoline. You now created another problem because it ends up in the water. It had bad taste properties. It was, somewhat toxic. So it's always safe. Safe is not a term you want to use with chemicals. It's always a safer chemical. It's a safer process. It always has to be in comparison with the context of what you're doing, what you're replacing.
So do you think, Scott, that it's a matter of time that, let's say all the chemical formulations, okay, or chemical substances used on chemical formulations are going to have a certain level of, let's say, a certain hazard level. It's just a matter of time to discover impact, effects, and you determine the maximum concentrations. Do you think that in the future there will not be any safe chemicals like this, even water?
I mean, I think everything, it's again going back to the hazard, where there's a range of hazard. There's always going to be some impact. There's never going to be zero impact. There's always a few, depending on how it's used, depending on the scenario, how much it is, there's always going to be some sort of an impact. The idea that we could never have an impact is not right. We're always looking for something with less impact, but there's always going to be trade-offs. And that's one thing we're trying to do within ZDHC, is look at a sort of a sustainability index across the board for chemicals, where we're looking at the hazard, we're looking at how it's used in terms of what are the potential routes that it might have exposure. We're looking at how much energy does it require when it's used in a factory, how much water, so you can make those comparisons, because there's always going to be a trade-off.
Yeah, it's going to be a continuous effort. The next word is another big one, and this is for Pamela, is biodegradable. I looked on the internet, and the rise of biodegradable fashion. What is biodegradable fashion?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, because actually the term biodegradable itself is fairly clearly defined. It goes back to a paper that was released in 2004. And if I just can quote that, it's a substance or a compound is biodegradable if it can be decomposed by the action of microorganisms. And microorganisms in this context are active or inactive fungi or bacteria. And then you have the sort of typical pathways: compost, soil, freshwater, marine water. And then there's a huge discussion going on about the landfill, because it is an anaerobic context as opposed to aerobic context where all the other ones are. So actually, there's a very clear definition of what biodegradable means. And it obviously, the question then is, if we talk textiles and fashion, is that product we hold between our hands compatible with any of those pathways, to go back to use Ignacio's concept, to go back into the cycle in some way or other. And in that sense, it's not something that technically could be abused as a term, because it does have a very clear definition in contrast to many other terms that we've heard today. However, it is interesting to see that is often confused with bio-based, meaning anything from something that comes out of a originally organic material, very often something that comes from as a replacement of fuel or petrol-based, and hence is a bio-based equivalent or replacement of that. The two have nothing to do with one another. It can be very well bio-based, no way biodegradable, and the other way around. Correct. So biodegradable, in conclusion, biodegradable is very clearly defined. There's really tests, ISO tests to test that, so you can't go wrong. But in claiming that, provided you've done your homework, you've gone down the line of really doing the tests and following the definitions that exist.
Which I guess, and you may agree with me, that the brands or the companies using biodegradable, they have not tested all their products to confirm the level of biodegradability, right?
Absolutely, and it's more than just that, because in terms of ISO standards, we do not have a unified standard for textiles to be tested against biodegradability. There are proprietary tests by whatever the plethora of testing labs out there. And there is a test, in fact, for leather. It's ISO 20136 that does that for leather. But for textiles, in principle, we do not have one. You can copy them and adapt them to textiles and hope for the best. The proprietary ones, digging them in, digging them out again. There are ways how to kind of try to get to that, but that's part of the issue. And yes, none of that is cheap. Consequently, not none, but most of the brands wouldn't go down that route just for cost reasons.
That's a very good point, Pamela, because biodegradability test cost a fortune. I mean, it's some close to 10,000 euros. I mean, for 270 days test is quite expensive.
I mean, it depends a bit which proprietary lab test you'd be using, but I think it's two types of cost. One is monetary cost, and these vary anywhere between 2,000 euros to 10,000 euros, potentially more. But the issue is time, because to do it the way we do it today, you easily spend 6 months, because it has to be underground. And in terms of it being replicable, difficult, because no 1 year is exactly like the year before and the year after.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point. Thank you. Thank you. Now we go to another video, because we're going to talk about recyclability with Ignacy. And okay.
Wear brown shoes after 6. Wear a hat indoors. Wear a short skirt after 40. Wear a short skirt if you're a man. Try too hard. Don't try it all. Dress like a girl. Dress like a man. Dress like a teen. Stand out. Blend in. Mix prints. Mix pink and red. Show your panty line. Go commando. Cover up. Show it all. Be trashy. Be neat. Wear pink. Wear blue. Wear yellow if you're blonde. Wear red if you're a redhead. Wear socks and sandals. Look fake. Look chic. Look chic. Be a princess. Be boring. Take a stand. Be uniform. Be liberated. Be old. Be new. There are no rules in fashion, but one. Recycle your clothes.
Ignacy, this commercial was meant to promote recyclability. Yeah. So what is your first impression about it?
Yeah, they're really funny guys. I mean, they're really masters of how to communicate things. I think, well, the most amazing thing is having Iggy Pop as an icon of recyclability. That means long lasting, right?
That is vintage.
Yeah. So if we talk, I mean, recyclability is a little bit of it's not a buzzword, but is a technology that has been, vastly, misleading, you know, because most of the reality in terms of recyclability or recycling things is about downcycling things. I don't know if you are going to ask the word upcycling, you know, because it's also a little bit controversial, by the way. But I think the main thing about recyclability is, for instance, in the Cradle to Cradle, in the new version of Cradle to Cradle, we don't say recyclability either. We said cyclability. And the thing is that we are not resourcing, we are sourcing again and again, you know. So I think the point is we need a system that is the use of non-renewable virgin raw material sources is decoupled from our activity. That's the key thing. And then I'm using the right words, the source of non-renewable and non-regenerative or replenished raw material virgin sources, you know. So I think that recyclability is also about, what kind of technology is being used, you know. For most of the time, people, when they talk about recyclability, they're talking about mechanical recycling things.
Yeah.
Whether we know that in a circular economy, you need both mechanically recycling and you also need chemical recycling.
Yes.
Because otherwise, you will never break down to the building block level, you know. So that's very clear. But yeah, back to the HEM, by the way. The funny thing about HEM is that HEM has a very strong statement about everything has to be either renewable or recyclable. And this is something that is quite a strong statement, you know, because it's It's looking at the different cycles and different nature of products, and how you can manage all this. So, yeah.
Do you think that is it possible to continue recycling everything forever? Because even something that has been recycled, it cannot be recycled forever. I mean, it has a, it can be recycled once, twice, maybe. That's it. So there will be a moment that would not be any recyclable materials. I mean,
well, the recyclability potential depends on quality and depends on the next use of the product, but also depends on how the product has been defined in the first place. You take some products like nylon, for instance, some thermoplastics, polyamides. If you don't use ingredients or a lot of additives on these, they are potentially, and I'm saying potentially, endlessly recyclable. I think the problem with some fibers, especially with natural fibers, is that you are getting length issues with the recyclability of the fiber, So it's a mechanical problem. That's why the combination of mechanical cycling and chemical cycling can really handle quite a lot of the different scenarios. Of course, nothing will be endlessly recyclable at the product level. But the thing about us is that we define recyclability at the chemical substance level. So we talk about how many cycles you can apply to a certain building block, to a certain component, and that's why I like the way of thinking that saying safer is a better word than safe. But that's also the reason why we use safe than circular and not circular in the first place, because the potential of circularity of the product depends very much on how you define positively the chemistry of the product in the first place. Right. By the way, I think that I'm coming from the food ingredient industry. So I think we are, taking a lot of the relatively wrong lessons from the food industry when we talk about natural versus artificial, when we talk about handmade, about something that comes from a bio-based product, there's a lot of, all of these attitudes that they are now being, brought to the fashion industry, they come from some other industries where we didn't fix those problems in the first place, Right. So we had already inherited a way of framing the language. That is
well, that's true. We are the use of the language is key to make people understand. We move to the future now. So there will be an all group discussion. Let's watch a nice video by BBC, I think. So let me ask you how we got here. How we ended in this situation where mass fashion is causing a big problem in terms of overconsumption, on a reduction of resources, on bad use of resources, and also passing on crazy messages just to kind of have more than customers to have addicts, fashion addicts. So we ended up here. How can we fix that? What would you recommend to do to the people out, on the fashion side, to change, to think about, to stop this madness? I don't know, Adriana, what do you think?
It all boils down to perception of the value, I think. If you value your garment as something disposable and you don't care, of course, you're not going to take into consideration when you bought it in the first place, what's in it. So I think one part is, re-educating the citizens, and the government involvement is necessary in a way. Having the transparency would help, certain measurements, and of course, innovation would be necessary to assure the future, responsible future. So if we have the synergy of all these elements, I think they can create the necessary progress in the social behavior, which of course, will impact the environmental aspects and as well as economic aspects. I mean, this model, worked for a certain period of time, but at the cost of people, at the cost of the environment. So it's very important, to change this social behavior and re-educate ourselves. I mean, sometimes I get mad with the videos because I know they want to make an expression of like, like just to create a contrast, like everything is peachy and nice from one side, and then like really the harsh facts. Yep. But I know visually that creates the contrast, but also what I think it's important is to show potential solutions, because there are many other examples of like what the solutions are. So I think in these series, like, creating this like harsh contrast and making people realize, I know visually people need that because that's what they've been trained with. Even sometimes it's not even the visual, it's like until it happens in their own place that they react to it.
Yeah, I agree. But we will never convince end consumers to do the right thing, to consider fashion as a high added value in the way we're working today, right? Because I don't know, Pamela, how sustainable in the right term, in the right sense of the word, sustainable over time, how far can we go with the model of business that we are, the brands are working by today?
I mean, if it was just for the scientific facts, it was outdated 10 years ago. And the reality is, it's the growth model as it's been advocated for the last 100 or so years. It worked to a certain extent while the proportions were right. So you had a relatively small consumption relative to a large system. Now, this has obviously swapped. Growth, the way it's defined, is not viable anymore. And today we need to get comfortable with what the economists hate, which is the steady state economy, meaning it's a kind of a replacement thing. So that's the reality. What does that mean? Well, replacement, less for us here, some more for others. But this is where I think things like cradle to cradle, but also in particular the concept that's arise around the donut economy, where you've got the carrying capacity with the planetary boundaries and the SDGs mapped up against one another, both of which are not 100% as of yet, but largely quantifiable, tied to human rights, and not just tied to human rights as in us humans, but tied to the rights of living beings on our planet. Because, I mean, have no illusions, the planet will doing fine.
Yes.
We're the ones
without us
who are on the line.
Yes. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, the planet will do fine, but we are not going to be here. So, Scott and Ignacio, you are at DHC and Cocircular. I mean, let's say the less we use, the less we buy, probably the better it is for everything related to substances, circularity or safe. I mean, it's a matter of changing the business model. People buy less of higher added value, right?
Yeah, no, go ahead, Ignacio.
Okay, if we're asking us about that, I think the problem is not about consumption. It's about what we are consuming and what we are using. I think the problem is that we are interchanging the wording here. I mean, we are talking consumption, whether we're using products, we're not really consuming textiles. We are not eating textiles. We are not. So, and I think this is very much a link to the business model. I think the problem is not that much how many resources we use, if we use them smart, but how do we use them and what kind of a business model, how we can increase the intensity in the use of resources, So things like renting or leasing jeans and things like that, there are already a number of business models in the market. And by the way, this is very much, I mean, the fast fashion is the worst case scenario on that, because even from a new business model perspective, is more challenging than, for instance, luxury items, because the durability and the time scale of the use of the product is very important. We are now taking this use phase and how to measure the use of the product, even to the carbon management strategy. So we are now developing methodologies to test how do we use carbon all along the full cycle of the product, So I think this is one of the things we can use to to make a shift in the language. Right. So what I said before, the coupling the activity of the dilapidation of non-renewable resources is one of the fundamentals of a circular economy model.
Right, and Scott, just on this part, let's say, the less we use in terms of chemicals as well. The more conscious are people, brands, laundries, and everything. To use less, the better would be for everyone, right? So less means also less chemicals of concern, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's, there's paying attention to how they're doing things at facilities and building in, the waste component. If you're, if 30% of the materials are ending up off spec, or you're wasting material, that's an obvious one to solve just by paying attention and bringing some of the manufacturing practices into the 21st century where maybe they aren't there yet. And I think that we have to look at, with respect to how the chemicals are used, connecting up with other industries, because the reality is it's not just fashion. You could talk about fast electronics too. How many versions of headphones do we have, or iPhones, or anything? Those are all, people tend to replace those much more quickly than you would if you were just, from a reliability standpoint or a function standpoint. So I think we can connect up with the other industries in terms of looking at what are the models for recycling chemicals across these industries, because we certainly have a lot of chemicals brought into the textile industry that are waste products from other industries, and that's good. But you don't want to bring in their waste products as well into the textile loop. And I also think if the circle just keeps getting bigger because we're sucking more and more material into it, that's not right either. We have to somehow change the model. But I think where the fundamental first step is, the brands, and you have to know where things are produced, you have to know what's used, what goes into it, then you have to make an honest assessment of what are the hazardous properties of those chemicals, where did those materials come from, and then decide whether that's something you want to do. And I think it looks like today is a daunting problem, but I think fundamentally brands, and then getting the consumers to focus just on asking those simple first questions, is the only way we're going to really get to the bigger solution.
That's right. I like this comparison with other industries. When I watch these videos talking about fashion, the second largest polluter in the planet and everything, I say, first, it's not true. It's fake news. But okay, it's a kind of black legend we kind of have to live with. So thanks. We are moving now to the questions. I hope there are some questions. So now is Annie taking over. So just take it away, Annie. Thank you.
Yes, we did get some great questions. In particular, were two that I really want to get spoken on. So I'll start with Sophie's question. And this is to everyone. It did come at when we were discussing safe chemicals though. So Sophie's question is the problem that there are no standards behind any of these terms, but what organization would be able to set a standard and have it recognized on a large scale? Many also say there are too many standards out there. Is there a solution? And anyone can take the floor.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think part of what ZDHC is trying to do, and has tried to do over the past 10 years, is bring together the major brands, producers, and come up with some sort of a standardization around what is the list of chemicals that we're going to all work off of, and how do we expand that list in a common way so that we don't have 15, 20, 150 lists of restricted chemicals, because the reality is if you overlap them, they all agree to within 80 or 90%. And so how do we come up with definitions and all decide that we're going to use a specific definition for, hazardous in the context of textile use? And it's, I think we're getting there, but it's still a slow movement sometimes, because you have, people want to claim the space of I'm more sustainable and I've got 3 more chemicals on my banned list, so therefore my company is, takes this more seriously than my competitor. And until we remove that competitive aspect, it's difficult. But that's, I think we're moving in that direction, not as fast as I'd like, but certainly faster than I saw we were going 10 years ago on trying to align on these things.
Maybe to add on to, there are terms that we have today on our list, like green or like eco-friendly. They're just not quantifiable. They are intentionally left fuzzy and are used as being fuzzy, because that's what their purpose is. And then you've got others like the biodegradability, and increasingly also everything around sort of, is it recyclable? Because we've got a much closer definition of what that scientifically means. And the closer we can move to something that is quantifiable and scientifically definable, the closer we move to something that is a standard. And then you will keep having people using this like green, eco-friendly, because that's the whole purpose. It's so fuzzy, you can suggest anything and everything. But for those that want to prove progress, they're moving closer to the very clearly defined and stringent terms, because they know they say something. And that's where also standards kick in, and why we have organizations like the ISO organizations, not only, but also that have put scientific terms and testing methods and so on and so forth around those terms.
Yeah, right, Annie.
All right, thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Scott and Dr. Ravasio, for that. And next we have one from Marzia. And this came in also during our discussion of safe chemicals. And we kind of laughed about the term chemical-free marketing, because it's just not possible. But what about toxic-free marketing? Because we do see that term used a lot as well. So Scott, maybe you can take this one.
Yeah, again, I would steer clear of it. I think it's, toxic again is it's a context, and it's, it can be less toxic, it could be more toxic, but it's a lot like safe, and it's one aspect of the hazards that could be out there. So I think it's, when people say it's free of toxics, they're unconsciously making a comparison. They're comparing it to something. But I think in general, I would stay away from that, because again, it's not very precise. And if you have 2 products that both say they're toxic free, well, one of them, there's clearly going to be a difference, and one of them will have, less toxic effect than the other. And so we can't just end up with a whole universe of less toxic either, because there's clearly going to be differentiators between those products. And that it may be that from a hazard standpoint and toxicity to human health, they're the same, but they may have different requirements in terms of the amount of carbon footprint that's generated when those chemicals are manufactured, or things like that go into the broader picture.
I think time for one more.
Expect that a product would no company wants to make a toxic product that makes their consumer sick. So it's somewhat of an empty statement.
Of course. Okay. Yes. And what time for one more question? Yes. Okay, yes. So we had sum up our conversation pretty well. So he said product development so far: a sustainable, green, transparent, and circular non-hazardous product for biodegradable, safe use. But which bin shall he throw it in? So
any of you take
the floor.
Well,
Ignacio, Adriana, Scott, go.
I think trying to define an ideal product as a reference is not a bad thing as such, you know. I mean, we know that some of these statements, they might look very aspirational, you know, but if we don't have an aspiration, we end up with depression, you know. So this is, I think, trying to be aspirational on doing that, I think is good, you know. On the other hand, I think that when we talk about fashion, we've been putting a lot of emphasis on fast fashion, considering that this is the evil in the fashion industry. And one of the remarks I wanted to make is that this is a problem all over the fashion industry and all over the textile industry. Whether this is a premium price product or this is a cheap, a cheap pair of denim jeans, it doesn't really matter, you know. It's the attitude against that, and the attitude, on the consumer, you know.
Yep.
And I think one of the lessons can be learned from some other industries. And when they are talking about transparency, I would also add traceability, you know. For instance, I think there are some lessons to be learned from, for instance, the food industry, where things like some specific labels, nutrition facts in the US, some other labels, you know, a positive list of ingredients, which is another thing. I mean, what does it mean plutonium-free jeans? I mean, nobody expects to have plutonium in jeans, right? So these kind of things, they are very counterproductive. And
okay. Okay, we are running out of time. So
just
it's
1
time
second.
for...
This last statement, it really pretty much like what bin to put it in. It's actually shows that when we have all these perfect things, the bin actually, like the system that we are missing is the actual bin. How to, you know, circulate all these practices. So so it's alludes to the systemic change that is needed. What bin?
All right. So, okay, that's, time now is 5:15 in Central Europe. So thanks very much for, you know, your wonderful collaboration and your comments, very enlightening. It has been a pleasure for me to moderate this debate with you. And listen, if there are any more questions, I invite the audience to send the questions to Amy or Joanne, because we will pass those questions to the panelists for, you know, response by email or discussion by email. So to all of you and to all the audience, thanks very much. Have a safe time, you know, in the present, under current circumstances. Stay well, stay safe, and looking forward to seeing you next time live, if possible.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us.
Okay,
Bye,
perfect. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Everyone.
Cheers. Okay, bye. Bye.
Society afternoon, but I need you.